Hi, so I'm going to show you how to paint a beautiful watercolour piece on Hahnemühle's new round watercolour postcards. They come in a round tin with 30 sheets. They are made from Hahnemühle's Expression watercolour paper, which is cold pressed and 100% cotton and 300 GSM, and they're 13 centimetres in diameter. So I'm starting with the background wash. I'm using a nice big sable brush and cadmium red with lots of water, and I'm just painting the background. I'm painting it really loosely because I want variation in tones. I want the colour to pool in different areas, and I'm just moving the paper around a little bit so the colour pools in different areas. When that's completely dry, I'm going to sketch, and I'm going to sketch using a peach coloured pencil. This is a peach watercolour pencil, the colour is Venetian red, and it'll just disappear into the paint when I paint on top. So I'm starting with the 4 fruits, 2 plums, 2 pears, and once I've sketched those in the middle, I'm going to add leaves to those, just thinking about how it works within the round composition. Once those are done, I'm going to add leaves on either side, just filling in the space, looking for the big gaps. And then adding smaller leaves and stalks for berries in the smaller gaps. Right, I'm going to start painting. I'm going to start with the pears, so I'm mixing up some yellow ochre and some sap green with a size 4 brush. And this is quite a wet mixture, and I'm painting wet on wet. So I'm allowing the colour to pool, and in some areas there's more yellow ochre, and in other areas I'm adding more of the sap green mixture. And while it's still wet, I'm adding a little bit more sap green in some areas. And while this is still wet, I'm going to sprinkle some salt on top, which is going to give a really lovely effect for the pear. I've used crushed up sea salt, but a fine table salt would actually be even better. So painting the second pear now using the same colour mixture. Really focusing on creating variation of tone and colour, so allowing colour to pool in different areas so that we've got some areas more yellow, some more green, several areas lighter and darker, and then while it's still wet, sprinkling that salt on top. And I'm just using a brush to brush off any excess salt that's anywhere else on the paper other than the pears. So right now we just want to leave the pears to dry. I don't want to touch them, but I'm going to get on with painting some other parts of the image. So I'm going to paint the plums next. So I've got alizarin crimson and viridian green, and mixed together that makes a really gorgeous plum colour. Again, I'm using a size 4 round brush to paint these, and focusing on creating variation and using wet on wet. So some areas have more water, some have more pigment. Some areas have more of the alizarin crimson pigment, so they're kind of more of a pink tone, less purple. And then painting the second one. And when I'm working, I always turn the paper around so that I'm pulling the brush in the direction that feels most natural to me, and also I'm not putting my hand in any wet paint. I'm just dropping in a little bit more shadow on one side. So while the fruit's drying, I'm going to paint the leaves next. So now I'm going to mix up the greens for the leaves. Obviously there are pre-mixed greens in this set, but I really like the subtlety of colour you get when you mix your own greens. So I'm using ultramarine and cadmium yellow to mix up a variety of greens. So just playing around with adding different amounts of blue and yellow, and I've also added a little bit of burnt umber to make it a bit more muted as well. So I'm painting the leaves now using my same size 4 round brush, and while it's still wet, I'm adding a bit more pigment to the tip of the leaf to give a bit of tonal variation and interest. And again, I'm turning the paper around as I work so that I don't put my hand in any wet paint, but also so that I'm always pulling the brush in a way that feels natural and comfortable to me. when you've got good control of the brush, you can get a lovely fine tip on the end of your leaf. So it's worth making sure that you're holding your brush comfortably and pulling the brush in a direction that feels natural to you. So I'm painting the leaves for the pear now, and I've added a little bit more yellow to this mix. My technique for painting the leaves is to paint 2 brush strokes for the outside and then fill in the middle, which gives you a nice neat leaf, and then add extra pigment to the end, which gives you a lovely variation of tone. So I'm painting some of the other leaves around the piece now. So I've added a bit more yellow to the mix for this one, still just using that combination of cadmium yellow, ultramarine and a tiny bit of burnt umber. Just filling in the smaller leaves now. And I've added a little bit more blue to change the colour of the green slightly, to add a bit of variation, and I'm painting a few more small leaves. So now I'm going to paint some little flowers. So again, I'm using the cadmium red and the same size 4 round brush, and I'm using a little bit more pigment than I used in the background mix, but still a very watery mixture. So the key with these flowers is to paint them with quite a watery mixture, and then while they're still wet, add a dot of cadmium red to the middle. So I'm picking up some pigment straight from the pan of paint, so it's quite pigmented, and then it'll spread into the wet paint and you'll get a really pretty effect. But you need to do that straight away while it's still wet. So I paint these one at a time rather than painting all of the flowers first and then doing all the little dots, because it won't spread. I didn't include these in part of the sketch, partly because they're so delicate, so I don't want any pencil lines showing through them, but also because I'm just placing them randomly. So I'm just turning this piece around and looking at where the gaps are and filling them in with little flowers. And now I'm using the same cadmium red, but with less water, to create a more pigmented mixture of paint, and painting little tiny circles that are going to be berries. I've realised there's a few gaps in the image, so I'm going back with my pencil and just sketching a few little stems for these berries. And then filling in another little flower in the gap. So now that's all completely dry, I'm going to get rid of all the salt. I'm just going to rub it off with my finger and tap it on the table, and I can use a nice soft dry brush if I need to brush any last little bits off. Do make sure that your paint is completely dry before you take the salt off, and you can see that's left a lovely effect on the pears. So now I've mixed up a little bit of lamp black and burnt umber to create a very deep brown that I'm going to use to add details. And I'm using a slightly smaller size 2 round brush now for these details. So I do the central vein on the leaves first, and then little veins coming out to the side. And it's worth really thinking about what direction you're moving your brush when you're painting the leaves, because as you lift your brush off the paper, it normally finishes with a fine point, just the direction that you're moving the brush, and also it's going to have less paint on it. So I normally start at the base of the leaf and then pull towards the tip, because then you get a nice fine point towards the tip of the leaf. So I'm just going around and adding little details to everything. So putting a few little dots in the centres of the flowers, putting the veins on the leaves, and putting the stems on the berries. And I'm doing this all with a size 2 brush. I really love this part. I love the contrast of having these neat lines over the top of the wet on wet effect on the leaves and the fruit. And I just love adding the little finishing details that bring it all together. The key to getting a really nice fine line like this is to have a steady hand and to think about the consistency of the paint on the brush. So you don't want it too watery, and you don't want too much paint on the brush. So you can always dab your brush on a bit of tissue paper first before you start painting to take off the excess paint, and you'll get a much smoother, neater line. So that's it, done. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial and have a go painting this yourself.